Hello everyone, I will be starting this series with a little refresh on some geometry topics. So it won't contain anything really new, it will mostly be rules and symbols that you already know. But in this chapter it's going to be important to know the names of these rules because you're going to be referring to them a lot. So that's why I will cover them very shortly. Before we get to those rules, I will also remind you of some symbols that you might see and that you should be able to use easily. After that, we'll go over some of those rules about angles. And lastly, I will mention a few things about similar figures. So those symbols, first of all, we had symbols to indicate parallel lines and to indicate perpendicular lines. So suppose I have two parallel lines and a line that's perpendicular, let's say L, M, and N, then I can say L and M are parallel by putting two stripes in between. And I can say M and N are perpendicular with this symbol. So these symbols are going to come back all the time, and it's going to be useful for you as well to use them to save time so you don't have to write out, if it lets me type, L is parallel to M or M is perpendicular to N. Okay, so we've got that going on. More interesting right now is going to be those rules about angles. So these, again, they're going to be nothing new. You know how they work. It's just important what are their names. So one that we have is if we have something like this, angle A, and it's spread out in 1 and 2, then we know that angle A1 plus angle A2 is 180 degrees. And it's important to know now for this chapter that we call that a straight angle. And we're going to have to refer back to that fairly often, so keep that in mind. Another thing we have is if we have some angles that connect in a point and go all around, then these three angles together make 360, and we call this a full turn. So again, it's the name that's important here. Lastly, if we have just any two lines that intersect each other, then the two opposite angles, so angle T1 is the same as the opposite angle. And also for the others, of course, angle T2 and T4 are the same. And in both cases, that is simply called opposite angles. So those are the names that you have to keep in mind. Throughout the chapter, we will find even more rules like this that we can use. One that we're still going to prove, but which we also kind of already know, is what happens in a triangle with the angles, or in a quadrilateral. We know that angle A plus angle B plus angle C is 180 degrees, and we know in a quadrilateral, angle D plus angle E plus angle F plus angle G is 360 degrees. And in both of these cases, we say that we know this from the sum of the angles. So those are some rules about angles and how we calculate with them. Later in this chapter, we're going to use these a lot. Now let's get to the last topic of the refresh, and that is similar figures. I'm not going to say too much about this, but I just want to remind you of a few things. So all I want to say about is how do we check whether two figures are similar? And important here is that we have to check two things. We have to check all of the angles, and we have to check, let's be more specific, that all the angles are equal. And we have to check that all the sides are enlarged by the same scale factor. It is not enough to only do one of the two. So the scale factor, we did that with a ratio table. You can find an example in the book. But it's not enough for only the angles to be equal. Because what I might have is a much taller figure that still has the same angles. This time it's not properly drawn, but that totally happens. And then it's not the same anymore. But the angles are still equal. Or it's also not enough to only check the sides. Because I might have, instead, a figure that has those same sides, but is dented inwards instead of outwards, so the angles are different. So I do have to check all angles and all sides, and that is all I wanted to remind you of. And now let's get on and start with the actual chapter.